Caroline Matilda was born in England in 1751. She was the youngest daughter of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Princess Augusta. She was born into one of the most powerful families in Europe. But Caroline Matilda would never have an ordinary life. From the beginning, her future was connected to royalty. She was raised at Kew Palace, surrounded by tutors, servants, and members of the royal household. She learned languages, music, history, and everything expected from a young princess. But Caroline Matilda was also known for being lively, independent, and full of energy. She was not the kind of girl who easily accepted a life controlled by others. But in the 18th century, royal daughters rarely had the freedom to choose their own future. Their marriages were often arranged for political reasons. And Caroline Matilda was no exception. When she was still a teenager, a marriage was arranged between her and Christian, the heir to the Danish throne. Christian was the son of King Frederick V of Denmark. The marriage was considered politically useful. England and Denmark had important connections, and a royal marriage could strengthen those ties. Caroline Matilda had never met Christian properly, but she was expected to marry him. She was only 15 years old. When she left England, she left behind the country where she had grown up. She left her family, her familiar palace, and everything she knew. She traveled to Denmark, where a completely different life was waiting for her. In 1766, Caroline Matilda married Christian. She became Queen of Denmark and Norway. She was only 15, and suddenly, she was living inside one of the most complicated royal courts in Europe. At first, the young queen probably hoped that marriage would bring her happiness. But her new husband was not the man she had imagined. Christian was emotionally unstable. His behavior could be unpredictable, and he struggled to maintain a normal relationship with his young wife. Caroline Matilda soon found herself living in a marriage where she felt increasingly alone. The royal court around her was full of political tension. People watched everything the young queen did. Every conversation, every friendship, every appearance. She was a foreign princess in a country she barely knew, and she had very little control over her own life. Then something even more difficult happened. Christian became increasingly distant from her. Instead of becoming a loving husband, he spent much of his time away from Caroline Matilda. The young queen was lonely. She was surrounded by luxury. But luxury could not replace affection. She had a palace, but she did not have the family life she had hoped for. And she had a crown, but very little real power. Still, Caroline Matilda tried to adapt. She learned about Danish court life. She appeared at royal ceremonies, and she performed the duties expected from a queen. Then, in 1768, she gave birth to a son, Prince Frederick. The birth of her child brought happiness into her difficult life. For the first time, Caroline Matilda had someone who was completely her own. Her son became deeply important to her. But behind the royal celebrations, her marriage was becoming even more complicated. Christian's behavior was becoming increasingly strange, and the people around him began to realize that the king needed help. Then a young doctor entered the royal court. His name was Johann Friedrich Struensee. He was intelligent, ambitious, and very different from the people surrounding the king. At first, Struensee was simply Christian's physician, but he soon became much more important. He gained the king's trust. He became involved in government. And slowly, he became one of the most powerful men in Denmark. Caroline Matilda also became close to him. At first, their relationship appeared to be innocent. But soon, the friendship between the young queen and the king's physician would become the center of one of the greatest scandals in European royal history. Caroline Matilda had entered Denmark as a young innocent princess. She had expected a royal marriage, a family, and a secure future. Instead, she had found loneliness, an unstable husband, and a court filled with political danger. And she had no idea that the man who seemed to understand her better than anyone else would eventually change her life forever. Caroline Matilda was still very young, but she was already living a life filled with loneliness. Her husband, King Christian VII, was becoming increasingly unpredictable. He spent little time with her, and the emotional distance between them continued to grow. Caroline had a crown, but she did not have the loving marriage she had once hoped for. Then Johann Friedrich Struensee became an important figure in the royal court. He had originally entered Christian's life as a doctor, but Struensee was intelligent, confident, and politically ambitious. He quickly gained the king's trust. Christian began relying on him. And soon, Struensee was no longer simply a royal physician. He was becoming one of the most powerful men in Denmark. Caroline Matilda also trusted him. For the first time, she had someone around her who seemed to understand her. Someone who treated her with respect. Someone who listened to her. And someone who did not treat her simply as a political wife. Their friendship became closer. And eventually, rumors began spreading throughout the palace. People started whispering about the Queen and the King's physician. At first, the rumors were dismissed, but the royal court was a dangerous place. Everyone was watching, and every friendship could become a political weapon. Meanwhile, Struensee was changing Denmark. He introduced a series of reforms. He wanted to modernize the government. He supported freedom of the press. He tried to reduce corruption. And he attempted to make the Danish state more efficient. But his reforms created powerful enemies. Many members of the old aristocracy hated him. They believed that a man who was not even a royal prince had gained far too much power. And they feared that the king was no longer truly ruling the country. Instead, they believed Struensee was ruling through him. Caroline Matilda supported many of the changes. She had become increasingly interested in political affairs. And for a young queen who had once been almost powerless, this new influence was exciting. But it also made her enemies. The more powerful Struensee became, the more dangerous his position became. And the more closely Caroline Matilda was connected to him, the more dangerous her own position became. Then, the rumors became even more serious. The court began questioning the relationship between Caroline Matilda and Struensee. Some claimed they were lovers. Others believed the accusations were simply political attacks. But the rumors refused to disappear. Caroline Matilda continued to appear at court. She continued her royal duties. And she remained close to Struensee. In 1770, Struensee became even more powerful. He effectively controlled much of the Danish government. He issued hundreds of orders. He changed laws. He dismissed officials. And he introduced reforms at an extraordinary speed. To his supporters, he was a modern reformer. To his enemies, he was a dangerous usurper. And Caroline Matilda was standing dangerously close to him. Then, another child was born. In 1771, Caroline Matilda gave birth to a daughter, Princess Louise Augusta. The official father was King Christian. But almost immediately, rumors began spreading about the child's true parentage. The rumors claimed that Struensee was the father. No official proof could settle the question. But the scandal became enormous. Caroline Matilda was now at the center of a political storm. She was a young foreign queen. Her husband was unstable. Her closest ally was becoming increasingly powerful. And powerful enemies were waiting for an opportunity. Then, that opportunity came. By 1772, the opponents of Struensee had created a plan. They wanted to remove him from power. And they wanted to destroy the influence of Caroline Matilda. A conspiracy was formed inside the royal court. The conspirators waited for the right moment. They knew the king was vulnerable. They knew the palace was divided. And they knew that if they acted quickly, they could take control. Then, in the early hours of January 17th, 1772, the palace was suddenly transformed. Soldiers entered. Struensee was arrested, and Caroline Matilda was taken into custody. The queen, who had once walked through the palace as a powerful royal woman, was suddenly a prisoner. She did not know what would happen next. She was separated from her children. She was questioned, and she was accused of adultery. The woman who had arrived in Denmark as a young princess was now facing the possibility of losing everything: her crown, her children, her reputation, and even her life. The royal court had turned against her, and the story of Queen Caroline Matilda was about to become one of the darkest scandals in European royal history. Caroline Matilda was now a prisoner. Only a few days earlier, she had been Queen of Denmark. She had lived in a magnificent palace. She had worn royal jewels, and she had been surrounded by servants and guards. Now, she was being held against her will. Her entire world had changed overnight. The men who had once bowed before her were now questioning her. The woman who had once been protected by the crown was now being treated as a threat. Caroline Matilda was accused of having an affair with Johann Friedrich Struensee. The accusation was extremely serious, because this was not simply a private matter. She was the queen, and Struensee was accused of having betrayed the king. The conspirators knew that destroying Struensee was not enough. They needed to destroy Caroline Matilda's reputation as well. Struensee was arrested. He was taken away from the palace, and Caroline was separated from him. The queen was terrified. She knew that her future was no longer in her own hands. She also knew that her children could be taken away from her, and that fear became one of the greatest pains of her life. Caroline's son, Prince Frederick, was still very young. Her daughter, Princess Louise Augusta, was only a baby. The thought of being separated from them was unbearable, but the political forces surrounding her had already decided that she had to be removed. Caroline was taken to Kronborg Castle, a massive fortress surrounded by water. The place was cold, isolated, and heavily guarded. The young queen, who had once lived inside a beautiful royal palace, was now trapped inside a fortress. She had no freedom, no control over her future, and very little information about what was happening outside. Meanwhile, Struensee was being interrogated. The authorities wanted him to confess. They wanted evidence against Caroline. And eventually, he admitted to having a relationship with the queen. That confession changed everything. Caroline Matilda was pressured to admit the relationship as well. And eventually, she signed a confession. The consequences were devastating. Her marriage to Christian was declared dissolved. She was no longer Queen of Denmark, and she would never be allowed to return to the Danish court. But the authorities faced a problem. They did not want to execute Caroline. She was the sister of King George III of Great Britain. If they killed her, the political consequences could be enormous. So a decision was made. Caroline Matilda would be separated from her children, and she would be sent away from Denmark. Imagine what that meant for her. She had lost her husband. She had lost her crown. She had lost her position. And now, she was being forced to leave her children behind. For Caroline, this was perhaps the greatest punishment of all. She was only 20 years old, yet she had already experienced more heartbreak than many people experience in an entire lifetime. Her marriage had failed. Her reputation had been destroyed. Her political enemies had defeated her. And now, she had to leave the country where she had been queen. In the summer of 1772, Caroline Matilda left Denmark. She was sent to Celle, in the German territory of Hanover. There, she would live away from the Danish court, away from Christian, and away from the political world that had destroyed her life. But Caroline was not completely defeated. For the first time, She had a chance to live without the constant pressure of the Danish court. She began rebuilding her life. She became interested in the local community. She received visitors. She spent time reading. And she tried to create a new home for herself. But there was one wound that never disappeared. Her children. Caroline wanted to see them. She wanted to be their mother. She wanted to watch them grow. But she was thousands of miles away from Denmark. And the political situation made regular contact extremely difficult. Her son Frederick remained in Denmark. And her daughter Louise Augusta remained there as well. Caroline could not simply return. She could not demand her children back. She was a former queen. But she had almost no power. Still, she continued to think about them. She had lost her royal title. But she had not stopped being their mother. And then, something unexpected happened. Caroline Matilda began to build a new life in Celle. She was still young. She still had dreams. And she still hoped that the future might give her some happiness. For a brief period, it seemed that perhaps, after everything she had suffered, Caroline might finally find peace. But fate had something else waiting for her. Because the young queen who had survived scandal, imprisonment, and separation from her children, would not be given a long life. Her greatest tragedy was still ahead. Caroline Matilda had lost her crown. She had lost her marriage. And she had been separated from her children. But in Celle, she was finally beginning to rebuild her life. She was no longer surrounded by the dangerous politics of the Danish court. She had her own household, her own residence, and for the first time in years, she had a little freedom. Caroline began taking an interest in the people around her. She supported local projects. She attended social gatherings. And she tried to create a peaceful life away from the royal court. People who met her in Celle often saw a very different woman. She was still young, still intelligent, and still deeply emotional. But the queen who had once lived under constant pressure, now had the chance to live more privately. Yet there was one thing she could never escape. Her children. Her son Frederick was still in Denmark. And her daughter Louise Augusta was growing up without her mother beside her. Caroline missed them terribly. She could not simply return to Denmark. And she could not raise them herself. The political decisions made after her downfall had taken that right away from her. Still, she remained interested in their lives. She wanted to know how they were growing, how they were being educated, and what kind of people they were becoming. The pain of separation never truly disappeared. But Caroline tried to move forward. She began developing a new identity. Not as queen. Not as the wife of Christian. But simply as Caroline Matilda. A young woman trying to build a life after losing almost everything. She also became interested in the arts, music, literature, and the cultural life around her. Her home became a place where people could meet. And she gradually gained respect in the local community. For a while, it seemed as though Caroline might finally have a peaceful future. She was still only in her early 20s. She had survived a political scandal that could have destroyed her completely. And she had begun to recover her dignity. But then, her health began to change. Caroline became increasingly unwell. At first, the illness may not have seemed serious. But it continued. She became weaker, and her condition deteriorated quickly. The woman who had survived imprisonment, political betrayal, and separation from her children, was now facing something she could not fight: disease. She was only 23 years old. 23. An age when most people are just beginning their adult lives. But Caroline had already been a queen, a wife, a mother, a prisoner, and an exile. She had experienced extraordinary highs and devastating lows. Now, she was running out of time. Caroline knew that she might never see her children again. She knew that she would probably never return to Denmark. And she knew that the life she had once imagined was gone forever. Her greatest wish, to be reunited with her children, remained unfulfilled. On the night of May 10, 1775, Caroline Matilda's condition became critical. She was surrounded by people who cared for her, but she was far away from the children she loved. She was only 23 years old, and the young queen who had once arrived in Denmark with hopes of a happy royal life, was now approaching the end of her story. On May 11, 1775, Caroline Matilda died at Celle. She was only 23. Her life had lasted just a little more than 2 decades. But within those years, she had experienced an extraordinary amount of history. She had been a princess of Great Britain, a queen of Denmark and Norway, a wife, a mother, a political figure, a prisoner, and finally, an exile. Her death shocked those who had followed her story. She had been taken from the royal court, separated from her children, and sent away. Only a few years later, she was gone. But Caroline Matilda's story did not end with her death. Her children continued to live. Her son Frederick would eventually become King of Denmark, and her daughter Louise Augusta would grow up to become an important figure in Danish history. Caroline never had the opportunity to watch them become adults, and that may be the saddest part of her story. She had lost her crown, but what she wanted most was not the throne. It was her children. She wanted to be their mother. She wanted to be with them, and she wanted the chance to live an ordinary life. But history never gave her that chance. Caroline Matilda's story is remembered because of the scandal surrounding her name. But there was much more to her life than scandal. She was a young woman placed into a royal marriage before she was old enough to understand what it meant. She entered a foreign country, lived with an unstable husband, became involved in a dangerous political court, and eventually lost almost everything. Yet, even after her downfall, she tried to rebuild her life. She found dignity again. She found a measure of freedom, and she continued to care about her children until the very end. Her story is not simply about a queen who fell from power. It is about a young woman who was given almost no control over her own life, and who paid an enormous price for the choices she made. But there is still one final question. What really happened between Caroline Matilda and Struensee? Was she truly guilty? Was she simply a victim of palace politics? And how did her short life change the Danish monarchy forever? That is the final chapter of Caroline Matilda's tragic story. Caroline Matilda was only 23 when she died. But her story did not end with her death. For years, people would continue to debate the woman behind the scandal. Was she a queen who betrayed her husband? Was she a victim of a cruel royal system? Or was she simply a young woman trapped inside a marriage she never chose? The truth is complicated. Caroline had been married at only 15. She was sent to a foreign country. Her husband was emotionally unstable, and she found herself surrounded by people who were constantly watching her. Then came Johann Friedrich Struensee. He was intelligent, ambitious, and one of the few people at court who seemed to understand her. Their relationship became the center of a political storm. And eventually, Caroline was accused of adultery. Struensee was arrested. The queen was imprisoned. Her marriage was dissolved, and she was forced to leave Denmark. But Struensee's story ended much more violently. After his arrest, he was convicted of serious crimes against the state, and in April 1772, he was executed. His death sent a powerful message throughout Denmark. The political revolution he had attempted was over. His enemies had won, and Caroline Matilda's influence had disappeared completely. Caroline herself was sent away. She lived the rest of her short life in Celle, far from the crown, far from Denmark, and most painfully, far from her children. Her son Frederick remained in Denmark, and her daughter Louise Augusta also remained there. Caroline could only watch their lives from a distance. She could not be the mother she wanted to be. but she never stopped caring about them. This is one of the most heartbreaking parts of her story. She had once been a queen, but the thing she wanted most was not power. It was her family. She wanted to see her children grow up. She wanted to be there for them. And she wanted a chance to live a normal life. But that chance never came. On May 11th, 1775, Caroline Matilda died. She was only 23 years old. Her life had ended before she had even reached the age when many people are beginning to understand who they truly are. She had been a princess, a queen, a wife, a mother, a prisoner, and an exile, all before the age of 24. Her death left behind 2 children who would never truly know their mother as an adult. Her son Frederick would later become King of Denmark, and her daughter Louise Augusta would become an important figure in Danish history. Caroline never saw any of it. She never saw her son become king. She never saw her daughter grow into adulthood. And she never returned to the country where she had once been queen. But her story survived. And perhaps that is why Caroline Matilda remains such a fascinating historical figure. Her life was not a simple fairy tale. She was a young princess sent away from home. She became a queen before she was ready. She entered a broken marriage. She found affection in a dangerous place. She became involved in political change. And then, everything collapsed. Her crown disappeared. Her marriage disappeared. Her freedom disappeared. And finally, her life itself disappeared. But there is another side to her story. Caroline was not simply a scandal. She was also part of a period of major political change. The reforms associated with Struensee challenged the old Danish system. They attempted to reduce corruption, modernize government, and introduce new ideas. Those reforms were controversial, but some of the ideas survived even after Struensee was gone. Caroline's story therefore became connected to a much larger transformation in Denmark, a transformation that continued long after she had disappeared from the political stage. And yet, when people remember Caroline Matilda, they often remember only the scandal. They remember the accusations, the affair, the imprisonment, and the dramatic downfall. But behind all of that, there was a young woman who was sent away from England, who became queen at 15, who wanted to be loved, who wanted to be a mother, and who wanted to find happiness. She never had enough time to find it. Caroline Matilda's life lasted only 23 years, but those 23 years contained enough drama for an entire lifetime. Her story reminds us that royal life was not always glamorous. Behind the crowns, the palaces, and the beautiful dresses, there were people who could be lonely, frightened, and trapped by the very system that gave them their titles. Caroline became a queen, but she never truly controlled her own destiny. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of her story. She was given a crown, but not freedom. She was given a palace, but not happiness. She became a mother, but was separated from her children. And when she finally found a place where she could live peacefully, her life was almost over. Caroline Matilda died far from Denmark, far from England, and far from the children she loved. But her name survived. Not because she was the most powerful queen, not because she ruled for decades, but because her life showed how quickly love, power, politics, and scandal could destroy a royal world. The young queen who arrived in Denmark with dreams of a new life, left it as an exile, and the crown she once wore became only a memory. Her story is a reminder that behind every royal portrait, there is a human being, with fears, dreams, mistakes, and heartbreak. Caroline Matilda was only 23 when her story ended, but more than 2 centuries later, the world still remembers the young queen, who lost almost everything, and whose life became one of the most tragic stories in European royal history. Visit my YouTube channel Sleepless Historian for more emotional royal history stories. Like this story if you enjoyed it. Comment below and tell me what you think about Caroline Matilda's life. Subscribe to Sleepless Historian for more stories of queens, kings, royal families, and the forgotten people behind history. Good night.